Paris is the city of love, lights, and dreams. Every year, millions of tourists flock here, drawn by the romantic image of the Eiffel Tower, the beautiful architecture, the rich history, and of course the food. For many, visiting Paris is a lifelong dream come true. But what if I told you that this dream for some people can turn into a bed of nightmare? The Paris Syndrome, a psychological condition that some visitors, especially those in Japan, experience when the reality of Paris doesn't quite match up with their high expectations. It can lead to a range of symptoms from anxiety and dizziness to even hallucinations. So how did we even come to know about Paris Syndrome? Let's take a little trip back in time. The term Paris Syndrome was first coined in the 1980s by a Japanese psychiatrist named Hiroaki Ota. Dr. Ota was working in France and started noticing that some of his fellow Japanese visitors were having these intense psychological reactions to Paris. Dr. Ota documented these cases and found that the symptoms often included feelings of extreme anxiety, delusions, hallucinations, and even a sense of persecution. Now you might be thinking, why Japanese tourists? Well, it's believed that the cultural differences between Japan and France are so vast that some visitors experience a sort of cultural shock. They arrive with such high expectations fueled by movies, literature, and advertisements, only to find that the real Paris doesn't quite match up to their idealized version. It's not just Japanese tourists though. Anyone with high expectations and sensitivity to cultural differences could potentially experience something similar. However, it's most commonly reported among Japanese visitors. So in a nutshell, Paris Syndrome is this unique blend of disappointment and cultural shock that can lead to some pretty serious psychological symptoms. It's a fascinating example of how powerful our expectations and perceptions can be. So what exactly do people with Paris Syndrome experience? Let's break down some common symptoms. First up, we have anxiety. Many sufferers report feeling an overwhelming sense of anxiety and panic. This can be triggered by the hustle and bustle of the city, the language barrier, or simply the shock of being in a completely foreign environment. Then there is dizziness and sweating. The physical symptoms can be quite intense, almost like a panic attack. Some people also experience palpitations and shortness of breath. Hallucinations and delusions are among the more severe symptoms. Some sufferers report seeing or hearing things that aren't there. Others might believe that people around them are out to get them, which is incredibly distressing. Depersonalization is another symptom, where individuals feel detached from their surroundings or even their own bodies. It's like being in a dream or movie rather than reality.
I've been thinking a lot ever since I ate that fruit. Why is there fruit? What is fruit? It's a thing that you eat? Why do we eat? What are we? Why are we? Why do I have these? Everything is weird. When you really stop and just look at it, everything is very, very strange. Why am I talking? What is this? My lips make a movement and a sound, and you know what I mean? Blows my mind.
So what causes these intense reactions? Well, it's a combination of factors. One of the biggest culprits is the gap between expectation and reality. Think about all the movies, books, and ads you have seen that paint Paris as the ultimate romantic and awesome destination. For many, this creates sky-high expectations, when the real Paris, with its crowded streets, occasional grime, and everyday challenges, doesn't live up to this idealized image. It can be a huge letdown. Cultural differences play a big role too. Japanese culture, for instance, is known for its politeness and orderliness. Paris, on the other hand, can feel chaotic and less structured. This cultural shock can be jarring. Language barriers can add to the stress. Not being able to communicate effectively can make visitors feel isolated and helpless. Plus, the fast-paced and direct communication style of Parisians can sometimes come off as rude or abrupt to those used to more reserved interactions. All these factors together can overwhelm some visitors, leading to the symptoms of Paris Syndrome. It shows the power of our minds and how it can shape our experiences. Now let's talk numbers. How common is Paris Syndrome and who is most affected? According to the Japanese embassy in Paris, around 20 Japanese tourists a year are affected so severely that they need medical attention. This might not sound like a lot of the millions of visitors Paris receives each year, but it's significant enough for the embassy to take notice and provide support. It's estimated that about 1% of Japanese tourists visiting Paris will experience some form of Paris syndrome, whether mild or severe. This has led to the embassy setting up a 24-hour hotline and even arranging for medical repatriation in extreme cases. So why these numbers matter? Well, they highlight that Paris syndrome, while rare, is a real phenomenon that can have serious implications for those affected. It's a reminder for all travelers to manage their expectations and be prepared for cultural differences. So what happens if someone finds themselves experiencing Paris syndrome? How it is managed or treated? First and foremost, if the symptoms are severe, it's important to seek medical help. Medical professionals might use a combination of therapies to help. This can include counseling to address the psychological distress as well as medication for anxiety or depression if needed. The key is to provide a supportive environment where the individual can feel safe and understood. But prevention is always better than cure. Here are some tips for travelers to set realistic expectations and hopefully avoid the shock that leads to Paris syndrome. First, do your research. Understand that Paris, like any big city, has its pros and cons. It's not all fairy tales and romance. There will be crowds, traffic, and the occasional grumpy local. Next, learn a few basic phrases in French. Even just knowing how to say hello, please, and thank you can go a long way in making interactions smoother and more pleasant. Try to immerse yourself in the local culture before you go. Watch French movies, read about the history and customs, and maybe even follow some French influencers. This will give you a more rounded view of what to expect. Be flexible and open-minded. Things might not always go as planned, and that's okay. Sometimes the best travel experiences come from those unexpected moments and spontaneous decisions. And finally, don't be afraid to take a break. If you're feeling overwhelmed, find a quiet spot to relax and regroup. Paris has plenty of peaceful parks and cozy cafes where you can catch your breath. Remember, traveling is about experiencing new things, and sometimes that means facing challenges. But with a bit of preparation and an open heart, you can make the most out of your trip and create wonderful memories. So there you have it. Paris syndrome might sound like something out of a movie, but it's a real phenomenon that affects a surprising number of people. By understanding it, we can prepare ourselves and make sure that our trips are as enjoyable as possible. Paris is an amazing city with so much to offer. Whether you're here for the history, the art, the food, or the romance, there's something for everyone. Just remember to keep your expectations realistic and embrace the experience with an open mind. Until next time, happy travels, and remember, the journey is just as important as the destination. Au revoir.